Jason needs the money more. You'll figure something out. That was the sentence my father used to erase 18 years of promises in less than 10 seconds. We were sitting at the oak dining table in the house I grew up in, the same house where he used to tell me, "Your college fund is safe. Your future is secure." My acceptance letter from the University of Michigan was still folded neatly in my purse, the paper slightly worn from how many times I'd taken it out just to make sure it was real. I had worked for that letter. Late nights. AP classes. A part-time job at the local grocery store earning $12 an hour to cover my own gas. I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. Jason leaned back in his chair that night, twirling his car keys around his finger. He had dropped out of community college twice already. First, he said it wasn't the right major. Then he said college just wasn't his path. 2 weeks earlier, he'd mentioned some kind of startup idea. Something about an app. I didn't understand it, but Dad did. Or at least he said he did. "It's an investment," Dad added, cutting into his steak like we were discussing the weather. "This could change Jason's life." I stared at him. "What about mine?" The room went quiet in that polite, suburban way where no one wants to admit something ugly just happened. Diane, my stepmother, cleared her throat softly. "Emily, honey, you're the strong one. You've always been independent." Independent. That word again. It sounded like praise, but it felt like an excuse. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just nodded slowly, as if I were processing a minor scheduling conflict instead of the disappearance of $48,000 that had been set aside for my tuition. $48,000. 4 years of security. Gone. "We'll help where we can," Dad said, finally looking at me. "But Jason needs this now." Needs. I thought about the summers the first spent babysitting instead of going on trips with friends. The scholarships I didn't apply for because I believed him when he said, "Don't worry about the money." I had chosen my school based on trust. That was my first mistake. Jason stood up, grinning. "It's going to work. You'll see." He sounded so sure. Like the future had already signed his name on the check. I excused myself and walked upstairs to my bedroom. The walls were still painted the pale blue I'd chosen when I was 13. My high school track medals hung from the same nail near the closet. Everything looked exactly the same. But something had shifted. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my banking app. 0. The college savings account Dad had shown me every birthday was empty. Not frozen. Not pending. Empty. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly, like a tire losing pressure. No explosion. Just quiet deflation. Downstairs, I could hear Jason laughing. I realized something then. I had always believed that fairness was automatic. That if you worked hard and kept your head down, people would keep their word. But fairness isn't automatic. It's conditional. And I was no longer part of the condition. I stood up, walked to my closet, and pulled out a duffel bag. Not because I had somewhere dramatic to go. Not because I wanted to prove a point. But because in that moment, I understood something clearly for the first time in my life. If my future was going to exist, I was going to have to build it myself. They invested in Jason. Fine. That was their choice. What they didn't realize was that the night they gave him my college fund was the night they gave me something else entirely. They gave me the truth. And the truth is a powerful place to start. The next morning I woke up before my alarm, even though I had barely slept. The house was quiet in that heavy way it gets after an argument that no one plans to resolve. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, drawing thin gold lines across my desk where my college brochures were still stacked neatly. I had organized them by tuition cost, campus size, and distance from home. I had compared meal plans and housing options down to the dollar. I had built my decision on numbers that no longer existed. Downstairs, I could hear the coffee machine start. Dad always woke up at 6:30. Routine was important to him. Predictability. Control. I lay there for a few more seconds, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words. You will figure something out. It sounded almost generous in hindsight, as if he believed in me. But belief without support is just a polite way of stepping aside. I got dressed and went downstairs. Jason was already at the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone, grinning at something on the screen. A brand new laptop sat beside him, still in the box. I did not ask where it came from. I already knew. Dad looked up when I walked in. For a brief second, there was something in his expression that almost looked like guilt. Then it disappeared. Morning, he said, as if nothing had shifted between us. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the far end of the table. The oak surface felt cool under my hands. When were you going to tell me? I asked quietly. Dad set his mug down. We were going to talk about options. Options. That word felt smaller than what had been taken. You told me not to worry about scholarships, I said. You told me to focus on school. He sighed. Emily, circumstances change. Jason came to me with a real opportunity. You are responsible. You will land on your feet. I watched him carefully. That was the first time I realized something important. In his mind, this was logical. He was not choosing favorites. He was allocating resources. Jason was a risk. I was a guarantee. And guarantees do not need investment. Diane reached across the counter and squeezed Dad's arm gently. We can help you fill out financial aid forms, she offered, her voice soft and careful. I nodded once. I did not trust my voice. After breakfast, I went back upstairs and opened my laptop. I pulled up the university tuition breakdown again. Out-of-state tuition. Housing. Books. Meal plan. The total looked different now. It looked impossible. I clicked on the financial aid tab and began reading about federal loans, grants, and work-study programs. I had never paid attention to these before. I did not think I needed to. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Hannah asking if I was excited about move-in day in August. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, I am still figuring things out. That afternoon, I drove to the community college 15 miles away and walked into the admissions office. The carpet was worn and the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. It was not the campus I had imagined. It was not the red brick buildings or the wide green lawns I had pictured. But it was real. And it was affordable. The advisor handed me a brochure and explained transfer pathways and tuition per credit hour. $120 per credit. I did the math in my head. I could work. I could save. I could transfer later. It would not be the story I planned, but it could still be mine. When I walked back to my car, the air felt different. Not lighter. Just clearer. I realized I had been waiting for someone to correct the decision, to call me back to the table and say there had been a mistake. That call was not coming. So I opened my phone, logged into the Federal Student Aid website, and began filling out the forms myself. If I was going to land on my feet, I would make sure I knew exactly where I was stepping. By the end of that week, I had submitted my application to the community college and accepted that my path would not look like the glossy brochures I used to tape above my desk. I started picking up extra shifts at the grocery store, volunteering for early morning inventory at 5 o'clock and closing the register at night when the fluorescent lights made everything look pale and tired. $12 an hour turned into $14 after my supervisor noticed I never called in sick and never complained. I opened a separate savings account in my name only and labeled it tuition. Every deposit felt small, almost insignificant, but it was mine. At home, Jason transformed the dining room into what he called his office. The oak table where we used to do homework was now covered in cables, a large monitor, and a whiteboard filled with arrows and bold words like growth and expansion. Dad hovered nearby most evenings, asking questions, nodding, offering suggestions. I watched from the hallway once as they leaned over the screen together, their faces lit up by possibility. I realized I had never seen that expression directed at my report cards or my acceptance letter. It was not anger that settled inside me. It was clarity. A few days later, an envelope arrived from the university I had planned to attend. Housing forms. Orientation dates. A bright brochure welcoming the class of incoming freshmen. I sat at my desk and read every page carefully before sliding it back into the envelope. I was not bitter. I was recalculating. That Saturday, Dad knocked on my bedroom door. He rarely knocked before. "We should talk about your plans," he said. I gestured for him to sit. He looked around the room as if he were seeing it for the first time, noticing the neatly stacked folders labeled scholarships and transfer requirements. "You are not still upset, are you?" he asked. I met his eyes. "I am adjusting." He nodded slowly, as if that was reasonable. "Jason is close to securing outside investors," he said. "If this works, there will be more than enough for everyone." I understood then that in his mind, I was part of a future return. A delayed benefit. "I cannot build my life on if," I replied quietly. He did not argue. He just stood up and patted my shoulder, the way he used to before middle school track meets. The gesture felt outdated, like something from a version of us that no longer existed. Classes started in late August. Instead of moving into a dorm 200 miles away, I drove 15 miles each morning in my 10-year-old sedan with 120,000 miles on it. The campus parking lot was crowded with commuters carrying coffee cups and backpacks that looked older than mine. Inside my first economics class, the professor talked about opportunity cost. The value of the next best alternative you give up when you make a choice. I wrote the definition down carefully. At night, after my shifts ended, I studied at the small desk in my room while Jason practiced pitching his idea loudly downstairs. Sometimes I could hear Dad laugh at something he said. Sometimes I heard silence instead. I did not ask for updates. I focused on my grades. 4.0 on my first midterm. 98% on my calculus exam. Each number felt like proof. Not for them. For me. One evening, I checked my email and saw a notification about a merit-based scholarship for transfer students with exceptional academic performance. The deadline was in 2 weeks. I read the requirements twice, then opened a new document and began drafting my essay. I did not write about betrayal. I wrote about resilience. I wrote about responsibility. I wrote about building something solid when the foundation shifts beneath you. As I typed, I realized something steady and unshakable had replaced the uncertainty from that dinner weeks ago. They had made a decision based on who they thought needed help. I was making decisions based on who I was becoming. The scholarship application consumed every spare hour I had. After classes, I drove straight from campus to the grocery store, worked until 9:30 at night, then came home and sat at my desk while the house settled into its usual rhythm. Jason talked loudly on conference calls downstairs, using phrases like seed funding and market traction as if saying them often enough would make them solid. Dad listened closely, offering advice, occasionally clapping him on the back. I could hear the approval in his voice even through the floorboards. I stopped resenting the sound. Resentment takes energy, and I needed mine elsewhere. Instead, I focused on precision. My grades had to be flawless. My transfer application had to be undeniable. In October, midterm grades were posted. 4.0 again. I printed the report and placed it in a folder labeled evidence. Not evidence for my father. Evidence for myself. Proof that I was not the backup plan. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to refill my water bottle and found Dad and Jason sitting across from a man in a gray suit I had never seen before. A leather portfolio rested on the table between them. Jason was explaining revenue projections with more confidence than I had ever heard from him. Dad noticed me standing there. "Emily, this is Mr. Wallace. He is interested in partnering with Jason." Mr. Wallace smiled politely. "Your brother has ambition," he said. I returned the smile. "I hope it works out." I meant it. Not because I believed in the plan, but because I had stopped tying my future to its outcome. Back in my room, I reread my scholarship essay and made small adjustments. I tightened sentences. Removed anything that sounded bitter. I wrote about taking ownership. About discovering that stability built by someone else can disappear without warning. About choosing to construct something steadier from the ground up. I did not mention my father. I did not mention Jason. I described the moment I realized I could either wait to be rescued or learn to navigate alone. The deadline came and went. I clicked submit at 11:48 at night, 3 minutes before the portal closed. I did not celebrate. I simply closed my laptop and went to sleep. November arrived with colder mornings and shorter days. My sedan struggled to start once, and I made a note to set aside money for a new battery. Tuition for the next semester was due in 3 weeks. I calculated the remaining balance after my part-time income and federal grant. There was still a gap. Manageable, but real. I added 2 extra weekend shifts. One Sunday afternoon, Jason burst into the house shouting that he had secured preliminary backing. Dad hugged him in the middle of the living room. Diane wiped tears from her eyes. I stood at the edge of the hallway and watched the celebration unfold. For a brief second, I imagined what it would feel like if that level of excitement had ever followed one of my achievements. Then I let the thought pass. That night, Dad knocked on my door again. "See," he said gently, "sometimes risk pays off." I nodded. "Sometimes it does." He hesitated. "You know we are proud of you too." The word "too" lingered in the air between us. I did not challenge it. Pride that comes after comparison is different from pride that stands alone. After he left, I opened my email one last time before bed. There was a new message in my inbox from the scholarship committee. My heart beat steadily as I clicked it open. The words were simple. "Congratulations." I read the first line twice to make sure I was not misinterpreting it. The award would cover full tuition upon transfer to the university next year. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle around me. Downstairs, Jason was still celebrating. In my room, I allowed myself one quiet smile. Not because anyone had invested in me, but because I had invested in myself. Winter settled in quietly, the way most changes in my life had begun to. I continued driving 15 miles to campus each morning, the heater in my sedan humming unevenly while frost clung to the edges of the windshield. My transfer scholarship was official, but it would not activate until the following fall when I moved to the university. Until then, I still had tuition bills, gas expenses, and the steady rhythm of work and study to maintain. I did not tell many people about the award. I wanted it to grow in silence, like something rooted deep enough not to be shaken by outside opinions. At home, the atmosphere shifted. Jason's excitement slowly turned into urgency. The preliminary backing he had celebrated required measurable progress. I overheard fragments of conversations through the thin walls at night. Words like cash flow and runway replaced growth and expansion. Dad's voice sounded tighter, less triumphant. One evening in January, I came downstairs to find stacks of printed spreadsheets covering the dining table. Jason ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the way he exhaled. Dad leaned over the numbers, frowning. "It is just a temporary dip," Jason insisted. We need another injection to push through. Dad did not respond immediately. He looked older in that moment, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. I filled my glass with water and returned upstairs without speaking. I understood something then about investment. It is easy to believe in potential. It is harder to sustain it. My semester continued steadily. I met with an academic advisor to map out my transfer credits, ensuring every class aligned with the university requirements. I picked up an additional certification course in business analytics that met on Saturday mornings from 8 until 11. The classroom was small and practical. No speeches about ambition. Just spreadsheets, formulas, and measurable outcomes. I liked that. Results did not rely on optimism. They relied on input. In February, an unexpected expense arrived. My car battery failed in the grocery store parking lot after a late shift. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the engine would not turn over. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the dashboard lights, calculating the cost before calling roadside assistance. $140 for a new battery. It felt significant. But I paid it from my savings without asking anyone for help. The receipt went into a folder labeled Independence. When I walked into the house that night, I heard raised voices in the living room. Not shouting. Not anger. Just strain. We cannot keep covering losses, Dad said firmly. Jason responded quickly, defensively, explaining market fluctuations and short-term volatility. I passed the doorway and continued upstairs. Their conversation did not require my input. Later that week, Dad knocked on my door again. He rarely entered without invitation now. How are classes? He asked, lingering near the frame. Good, I replied. I secured a research assistant position for next semester. It will help with experience. He nodded, distracted. That is great. His tone was genuine, but distant. For the first time, I did not feel the need to fill the silence between us. I had learned that approval feels different when it is not the primary currency of your life. By early March, Jason's office equipment began to disappear from the dining table. The large monitor was boxed up. The whiteboard erased. Dad spent more evenings alone in his study. I did not ask for details. I focused on preparing my transfer paperwork and maintaining my grades. One afternoon, as I reviewed my bank account, I noticed something unexpected. A deposit. $500. The memo line read "Car help." I walked downstairs and found Dad in the kitchen. You did not have to do that, I said calmly. He avoided my eyes. I should have thought about these things earlier. It was not an apology. It was not an admission. But it was something. I thanked him and returned upstairs, not because I needed the money, but because I understood the gesture. Sometimes recognition arrives quietly, long after the original decision has been made. I no longer needed to be chosen first. I had already chosen myself. Spring arrived slowly, marked less by the weather and more by the quiet dismantling of Jason's plans. By April, the dining room table had been cleared completely. The gray-suited investor no longer visited. The calls downstairs became shorter, then stopped altogether. One evening, I overheard Dad say, "We need to reassess," in a tone that carried more weight than anger ever could. Jason responded with silence. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt distance. My semester was ending, and final exams filled my calendar. I spent long hours at the community college library, reviewing notes beneath the steady hum of fluorescent lights. The place had become familiar now. Comfortable. Not glamorous, but dependable. I liked dependable. My research assistant position had officially begun, and I worked closely with Professor Martinez on a small data project analyzing local business trends. It was not dramatic work. It was detailed. Careful. Measured. The kind of effort that builds quietly over time. On the last day of finals, I walked out of the economics building holding my completed exam and realized I was no longer reacting to my family's decisions. I was operating independently of them. My transfer paperwork had been approved. In August, I would move 212 miles north to start at the university I once thought I had lost. The scholarship covered tuition. My savings would cover housing and books. I had calculated every expense down to the monthly cost of laundry. At home, the atmosphere felt different. Jason spent more time in his room, less time explaining future projections. Dad worked longer hours again, returning to routines he understood. One Sunday afternoon, he asked if I wanted to go for a drive. It was something we used to do when I was younger, driving aimlessly through neighborhoods under construction and imagining what kind of houses we might live in someday. I agreed. We drove in silence for several miles before he spoke. I thought I was helping him find direction, he said quietly, eyes fixed on the road. I looked out the window at passing storefronts. Maybe you were, I replied. He exhaled slowly. I did not consider what it would cost you. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging the full picture. I did not press him for more. Some realizations need space to settle. Back at the house, I began packing gradually. Not in secret. Not in anger. Just steadily. I folded clothes into cardboard boxes labeled apartment and stacked textbooks neatly in a small pile near my door. Each item felt like a step measured in inches, not miles. Jason knocked on my door one evening, something he had never done before. He leaned against the frame, hands in his pockets. I heard you got that big scholarship, he said. Yeah, I answered. He nodded. That is impressive. There was no sarcasm in his voice. Just recognition. Thanks, I said. We stood there for a moment, two people who had been placed on different tracks by someone else's decision. I did not ask for it to go that way, he added quietly. I believed him. I know, I replied. That was enough. In late July, I loaded my car with boxes, a small lamp, and the same blue comforter from my childhood bed. Dad carried the heavier items without speaking much. When everything was packed, he stood beside the car, hands resting on the trunk. You built this on your own, he said. It was not praise in comparison to anyone else. It stood alone. I looked at the house, the oak dining table visible through the window, the place where everything had shifted months earlier. I felt no bitterness. Just clarity. As I drove away, the highway stretching ahead in long, steady lines, I realized something simple and steady had replaced the uncertainty of that first night. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen the direction of my own life, and it was moving forward. Move-in day felt different from what I had once imagined, but not smaller. The campus stretched wide beneath a late August sky, brick buildings rising against rows of oak trees that had already begun to hint at fall. I parked my sedan in the student lot, unloaded my boxes one by one, and carried them up 3 flights of stairs to a modest dorm room with beige walls and a narrow window overlooking the courtyard. It was not glamorous. It was not guaranteed. It was earned. My roommate, Claire, greeted me with an easy smile and a stack of textbooks already highlighted in bright colors. She asked where I transferred from, and when I explained my path through community college, she nodded with respect instead of surprise. That was new. Classes began the following week, and the pace shifted immediately. Lectures were larger, expectations higher, conversations sharper. In my first advanced economics seminar, the professor wrote a single question on the board: what is value? Students debated market forces and intangible assets while I listened carefully, then added my perspective about opportunity cost shaped by lived experience rather than theory. The professor paused and nodded. That is a practical interpretation, he said. I wrote that comment down later, not because I needed validation, but because it marked a transition. I was no longer catching up. I was contributing. My days settled into a disciplined rhythm. Morning classes. Afternoon research assistant work under Professor Martinez, who had recommended me to a colleague at the university. Evenings in the library reviewing datasets or preparing case analyses. I tracked every expense in a spreadsheet, from groceries to laundry detergent. Rent for the following semester's off-campus apartment required planning months in advance. There was no safety net beyond what I built. In October, I attended a networking event hosted by the business school. I wore the only blazer I owned and carried a small notebook instead of relying on memory. Conversations were steady and professional. One recruiter from a mid-sized consulting firm asked about my background. When I explained my transfer journey and scholarship, he leaned in slightly. "That takes resilience," he said. I smiled politely. "It takes planning." By November, I secured a paid internship offer for the following summer, $22 per hour plus travel reimbursement. I calculated the projected income 3 times before allowing myself to feel relief. The number was not abstract. It meant fewer loans. More stability. One evening in early December, my phone rang while I was studying. Dad's name appeared on the screen. I answered after the 3rd ring. His voice sounded quieter than I remembered. "Jason is looking for work," he said without introduction. I closed my laptop gently. "What happened?" I asked. "The investors pulled out months ago," he replied. "He is trying to regroup." There was no blame in his tone. Only fatigue. I listened. He did not ask me for money. He did not suggest I step in. He simply updated me. "How are you?" he added after a pause. I glanced around my small apartment, at the stack of case studies on my desk and the internship offer email still saved in my inbox. "I am busy," I said. In a good way. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. I felt no triumph. No satisfaction in the reversal. Just a steady understanding that life does not always reward risk, and it does not always punish caution. It responds to consistency. Finals approached quickly. As I walked across campus one cold evening, the lights from the library glowing against the dark sky, I realized the distance I had traveled was not measured in miles from home. It was measured in decisions. Small, deliberate choices repeated daily. No applause. No dramatic confrontation. Just forward movement. I tightened my scarf against the wind and kept walking toward the building, aware that the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt constructed. The internship began in early June, and the city felt larger than anything I had experienced before. Glass. Buildings reflected the summer sun, and the sidewalks moved with quiet purpose every morning at 8 o'clock. I rented a small studio apartment 20 minutes from the office, measuring exactly 420 square feet, with a kitchenette barely wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. It was not luxurious, but it was mine. On my first day, I wore the same navy blazer from the networking event and carried a leather folder with printed copies of my resume, even though everything had already been submitted electronically. The firm assigned me to a mid-sized retail client struggling with declining quarterly revenue. My role was simple on paper: analyze operational inefficiencies and present recommendations. In reality, it meant hours of data cleaning, financial modeling, and double-checking assumptions that no one else had time to question. I did not mind the repetition. Repetition builds precision. By mid-July, my supervisor began asking for my input during team meetings. "Emily, what do the numbers suggest?" he would say, turning toward me instead of past me. I answered carefully, referencing margins, cost per unit, and projected savings. The first time a client nodded at my explanation, I felt something settle into place. Competence does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates quietly until it becomes undeniable. One afternoon, as I was reviewing spreadsheets, my phone vibrated against my desk. Jason's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once before answering. "Hey," he said, his voice different from the confident tone I used to hear downstairs at home. "I was wondering if you had a minute." I stepped into the hallway outside the conference room. "Sure." There was a brief pause. "I am thinking about applying for some entry-level positions," he said. "I never finished my degree. I was hoping you could look over my resume." The request was straightforward. No excuses. No comparisons. Just a question. I leaned against the wall, considering the distance between that dinner table months ago and this hallway lined with framed mission statements. "Send it to me," I replied. "I will review it tonight." "Thanks," he said quietly. After we hung up, I returned to my desk and reopened the financial model I had been building. The numbers on the screen felt steady. Measurable. That evening, I opened Jason's resume on my laptop in my small apartment. It was sparse. A few unfinished coursework lines. Some freelance attempts. I made notes in the margin, suggesting clearer descriptions, emphasizing transferable skills, recommending he consider completing certification programs. I did not lecture. I did not remind him of past decisions. I treated the document like any other project. When I sent it back, I included a brief message: focus on consistency. Employers look for patterns. He replied with a simple thank you. A week later, Dad called again. "Jason said you helped him," he said. There was something softer in his tone. He appreciated it. I sat at my small kitchen table, the city lights visible through the narrow window. "He asked," I said. Dad exhaled slowly. "You handled everything differently than I expected." I understood what he meant. He had anticipated resentment. Maybe distance. Instead, there was composure. "I learned to separate decisions from identity," I answered carefully. "What happened back then does not define what happens next." There was silence on the line, but it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt reflective. As the internship moved toward its final month, my supervisor called me into his office. "We would like to extend a return offer after graduation," he said. "Your work has been exceptional." I nodded once, steady. Not surprised. Not overwhelmed. Just aware of the path that had led here. Later that night, as I walked back to my apartment under the glow of streetlights, I realized something simple and quiet. The future no longer felt like something granted or withheld. It felt constructed, line by line, decision by decision. And I had built it without asking permission. Senior year arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic moment when everything suddenly felt secure. It was gradual. One completed semester after another. One internship evaluation marked excellent. One email confirming my return offer after graduation with a starting salary that once would have seemed impossible to imagine. I accepted the offer in early October, months before most of my classmates had secured positions. When I signed the contract, I paused for a moment, remembering the night I sat on my childhood bed staring at an empty account balance. The distance between those two versions of me was not measured in luck. It was measured in discipline. I graduated in May beneath a wide blue sky, wearing a cap that felt lighter than the years it represented. As I walked across the stage and heard my name announced, I did not search the crowd for approval. I already knew what I had done. After the ceremony, I found Dad and Jason standing near the back of the lawn. Dad's hair had more gray than I remembered. Jason looked steadier, older in a way that had nothing to do with age. "You did it," Dad said simply. I nodded. I did. There was no comparison to anyone else. No qualifiers. Just acknowledgement. A few weeks later, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment closer to the firm's downtown office. 780 square feet. Large windows. A small balcony overlooking the street. I furnished it slowly, choosing pieces I could afford without stretching my budget. A solid oak desk. A gray couch. A bookshelf that held not just textbooks, but framed copies of my internship offer and scholarship letter. Not as trophies. As reminders. My first paycheck arrived at the end of June. I studied the numbers carefully, subtracting rent, utilities, savings contributions, and student loan payments, even though the balance was modest compared to what it could have been. I set up automatic transfers to an investment account and labeled it Future. One Sunday afternoon, I drove back to the house where everything had shifted years earlier. The oak dining table was still there, polished and clear. Jason met me at the door. He had secured a steady position with a logistics company after completing a certification program. It was not the startup dream he once described, but it was stable. "I am glad you came," he said. We sat at the same table where Dad once announced his decision. The memory did not sting anymore. It felt instructive. Dad looked at me across the wood-grain surface. "I miscalculated," he said quietly. "I thought strength meant you did not need support." I considered his words. "Strength means you can survive without it," I replied. "But support still matters." He nodded, absorbing the distinction. There was no dramatic apology. No demand for repayment. Just clarity. Later that evening, as I drove back to my apartment, the city skyline appearing in the distance, I understood something fully for the first time. The money that was redirected years ago had never truly belonged to me. It was a promise. Promises can be broken. Skills cannot. Discipline cannot. Direction cannot. They invested in potential that was uncertain. I invested in habits that were consistent. The difference showed itself over time. When I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, the quiet space greeted me with a sense of ownership that no account balance could replicate. I placed my keys on the oak desk and looked around at the life I had assembled piece by piece. No dramatic confrontation had been necessary. No revenge required. The outcome spoke clearly enough. They once decided where the money would go. I decided where my future would lead. And in the end, that made all the difference.